Hello and welcome to another Patreon tutorial video. This video is going to be a little bit special and unusual compared to the normal topical tutorials because we're going to be finally talking about brushes. So I've been using, of course, my trusty set of brushes for a really long time, and ever since I made this Patreon, a lot of people have asked, can you share your brushes? And so far I've shared a couple, but the thing is I always feel kind of weird. It's like, I should probably share all of them, but if I share all of them, is it like encouraging people to just care about the brushes and all that stuff? So this time I'm going to finally do it properly. I'm going to share all the brushes that I use commonly and then explain, what each brush is basically used for. So yeah, this is going to be this video and hopefully you will find it helpful. So up first today, we're going to be talking about the basic painting brushes. Basically, brushes that don't really generate stuff for you. It's just that you have to paint everything yourself. But they do come with a couple of different types of brushes that I like to use. We have the eraser, which is really limited because I mainly just use it for sketching or basically erasing or balancing out layer masks and all that. That's why they are quite simple. And last but not least, I'm also going to share a bit of some brushes that I use for nature and basically organic shapes. So these will be the stuff that we'll be talking about today. So right before we begin, I want to make it really clear that these are the brushes that I've collected over the years. I did not create any of these from scratch. In fact, I'm still not too sure how to properly create a brush, so I'll definitely be honest with you here. So again, these are all brushes that I've collected over the years that I found that are really helpful, that are useful, and also they are also found quite commonly as well, right? I don't think these are like super rare brushes that are present in quite a few different brush packs, right? Sometimes when I remember I used to install another brush pack and then it turns out I found quite a few duplicates under a different name. So I guess this might be your experience when you download this brush pack. You might just find that you already have some of these common brushes. But either way, that's the disclaimer. I want to make sure that's made very clear. I don't claim credit to have made any of these brushes. But yeah, so let us begin. So immediately, let's talk about the main brushes. So these are the brushes that you'll spend 95% of the time with. As you can see, immediately I popped over to the standard brush because it's just so convenient, right? Just for general drawing or even writing, right? Because it can give thin opacity, it can give thick opacity, right? But we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But now, the name main is because these brushes are used 95% of the process. And the reason is that generally these brushes are mostly sort of opaque, but with some level of pressure control. Also, there's a varying amount of like hardness of edge. For example, this brush, the standard brush that I just used to write, it can be really, really solid when you press down a bit harder. So this brush is really good when you're blocking out things that are basically solid, right? You just want to block in the color in this area. For example, you just want to block in a value in that area. This brush is really good. So let us introduce the rest of the brushes one by one, right? So the first one is HSC, I think stands for hard soft chalk. It's definitely one of the brushes that I renamed to help me make it read a bit easier, make me recall it a bit easier. And the reason I named it as such is because it has a hard and a soft edge. So if you look at this my sort of pen cursor here, if I stroke this downwards in the direction of the stroke, right, in the direction of stroke, so let's say I'm stroking downwards, right, in this direction, the right side of the stroke, right, imagine you're a car driving on this road and you're driving this way, right, on your right hand side it will be the harder and more opaque edge, and on the opposite side, the left hand side, is the softer and less opaque edge. So this is kind of why I call it a hard soft brush. So again, if we take the same concept and we reverse, right, we're going upwards, right, you'll notice that the right side, again, the same right hand side of the brush is more opaque, whereas the left hand side is a bit softer. And this relationship holds true even if we do things very, very lightly, right? For example, if we do it like this, super lightly, and the left side is actually, you notice it's actually a bit soft. So that is why I call it the hard soft chalk. it is really helpful when we're trying to like say draw a form, right? Let's say we have this form here, and then let's say I want to add a bit of soft stuff here, but I don't want to go in and airbrush just yet, right? I can try something like this, and right now, as you can see, my opacity here is being adjusted, right? For example, now I want to have a softer stroke, so usually what I'll do is I'll hit 2 on my keyboard, and then I'll paint it like this. And then when I want it to be heavier, I can just press 6 and press it like this. So by using this can really help you manage your own pen pressure. You don't have to completely rely on pen pressure, right? So for me, I don't like relying on it too much. And plus, with a cheaper tablet, you know, and there's all that kind of stuff like that, right? But what is super reliable is opacity. So yeah, I think a good idea is always to use the hotkeys from like 1 to 0 to control the opacity, so you can like paint really easily and get the exact amount of paint or exact amount of color value you want. So I digressed a bit, but let's move on to the next brush, and that is the rough flat brush. So the rough flat brush is, as the name says, rough and flat, right? So the thing about this brush is that it doesn't really have any hard edges. You can see that the moment I start changing direction, the brush gets really sort of fuzzy. And this is good because sometimes when I'm painting in the area where in the future I know I want it to be textured, let's say for example, I'm painting like a rough wall here, right? So this is how I will paint it as a placeholder, right? Or perhaps even as a final texture, because this is sort of really just a generic rough texture that is quite helpful. And the reason why it's in my standard brush and not in the texture brush is because it's so easy to use. Because for example, if let's say instead of wanting to create a texture, I just want to make sure that the area is painted in a flat color, right? I can simply press harder and all the texture disappears. So this is sort of the flexibility of this brush. Of course, let's say I want to draw a very thick stroke. I can color it over a couple of times, of course, and then you still get quite a hard edge, right? So this brush is flexible in that sense that you can stay with it when you're painting in rougher, not quite details, but rougher features or rougher parts of the painting where you intend for it to not be too sharp or too rendered. This brush is, I think, quite perfect for my purposes at least. Again, of course, all this is subjective. I definitely think that at the end of the day, you should all try them out for yourself and see if it works for you this way. And so this is why I use the rough flat brush. So yeah, one more thing. Let's just say instead of having the rough flat brush color in the texture, right? Instead of having this effect, right? What if we just use, let's say, our standard brush? So this is where the standard brush falls a bit short. It's not really good at creating texture or even simulating texture, because it's gonna look like this, right? It's gonna imply some weird forms, because unless you really spend like so many brush strokes to try and remove the form or whatever, it's not gonna look good as a placeholder texture. Sometimes I still use that out of convenience, but generally this is why the rough flat brush has its place. So the standard brush I've already explained, but I think what's really good about this brush is that it's both controlled, its opacity and its thickness is both controlled by your pen pressure. And of course, you can also, in addition, control the opacity with the opacity slider to make things easier on yourself. So for this brush, I think it's a really standard brush. Let's say this is a stroke at maximum pressure, right? Perfect for filling in areas, right? Perfect for filling opaque areas. You don't have to worry about any sort of opacity issues at all. And then this is it at minimum. So you can create a really thin line, right? Let's say I'm drawing a character's single hair strand, like a small but not tiny hair strand, right? I'm drawing a character's hair, right? This will be really helpful, right? So this is quite a useful brush, and especially for sketching, this brush will do quite well as well, because you can do a variety of things with this brush, and it's really convenient for me because I don't like constantly switching brushes, so I can stick with this one and do a lot of stuff just with this. So this is why I call it the standard brush. And next is the standard softy brush. So this is basically the airbrush, right? There's nothing too special about this. This is basically a simple airbrush. This is, yeah, just the airbrush. There's not too much to talk about it. This brush is really useful when, let's say, I'm pretty much usually nearing the end of the painting, or I'm managing a layer mask, right? So let's say, for example, we create a layer mask for our little texture blob here, and let's say I want to gently ease it away. So this is really good for sort of gently erasing it away, right? Can ease it away. And this is kind of this kind of softness that you don't get from the rest of the brushes, right? The rest of the 3 main brushes, right? So this is why it has its place, because it really, really helps, gives you that very soft touch that sometimes you just need. Even early on in the sketch stage, if you're trying to create a lighting effect, it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of energy and try to balance your brushwork so your lighting, your bloom lighting looks even and all that. The airbrush is really helpful for this case, but for normal painting, I rarely use it. Usually it's to sort of manipulate and deal with layer masks and help to blend, right? I think the key word here is blend. And so at the same time, okay, so let's take a look at how I will blend for this. Right, this is how I'll sort of blend. Right, constantly using the color picker to sort of grab the color that I want, or even grab a more extreme color. So for example, if I want this area to be dark, what I feel like one of the best ways to do it is not to pick the color itself and then to try and paint, because what that's going to do is to make you go over it a lot of times to finally get the color down, and then you have kind of like spilled over, right? Like if you see me try to do this, it's kind of spilled over and make the form a bit weird, right? Because now we have like 60% this shade and 30% this shade. So rather, I like to pick a very dark color, like an extreme color, and then just tone down on the opacity or just lighten up on the pen pressure. Right, so this is kind of how I like to use this brush, just to blend stuff. Mostly skin texture, because skin tends to be smoother, especially when looking at it from far away. Because for clothing and stuff, and walls and other stuff, you kind of can justify it with a bit of texture. It's fine, but usually it's difficult to justify like skin having this sort of texture, because then it will kind of imply that it's kind of really weird scar or something, right? Yeah, so this is kind of what I like to use it for, as well as stuff like fog and controlling quick masks, layer masks, and so on. And yeah, and so that's pretty much it for the main brushes. I think these are really important, because to my workflow at least, because I spend all my time using them, and they each serve their own little niche. Again, I think the most used is of course the standard brush, because it's the most flexible, followed by, depending on the situation, I'll bust out the hard soft edge brush as well, which gives a bit of how do I put it, it expedites things a bit, right? So let's hop over to the example here. I think the painting is pretty much done, right? But let's just say I want to go back and review a couple of things. Let's say I want to soften this edge here, right? It's looking a bit rough, I don't like it. So I can take the hard soft edge brush, right? I don't need to pull out the airbrush because I don't need it to be that smooth. But I can take the hard soft edge brush and start blending. Right, I can start blending. And after a bit of time and using it, you'll kind of get used to how this brush works. So after blending, you'll get this nice smooth transition, but it's still kind of brush strokey and still kind of textured. So this is a nice balance, I find, for this kind of use case, right? Usually during the middle stages of rendering, I like to use this brush because it's just good in this very unique way. Yeah, so this is this brush, right? Rough flat brush, I've explained. Standard brush, I've talked enough about. And since standard softy brush is basically an airbrush used for smooth stuff. Okay, so let's move on. Part 2, we're talking about particles. So the thing about particles is that there's lots of ways to do them. You can obviously, go in and like go in and dot stuff around. Or you can draw like the individual particles itself. And all that, right? Those are all options. And honestly, I think sometimes like hand-drawn particles look really good as well if you spend a good amount of time in them. And then they also tend to be like, and also if they tend to be a central feature, yeah, hand-drawing them could be a good option. But sometimes we just need a lot of particles and we don't want to waste time like varying the sizes or struggling with different things. So let's drop down a dark background here for our demonstration purposes. And then okay, give me a moment. Okay, let's get rid of this extra brush stroke here. Okay, so let's say you want to create a bunch of different lights, floating lights. The dust standard brush I really like, because it just drops in a variety of different size blobs and shapes here. Yeah, I think it's a really nice brush because it gives you a variety of sizes and it's really helpful. Yeah, so there isn't too much to talk about this, but it's just super nice, right? And if you don't need it in this way, let's say you're drawing rain, you can use this brush and then, filter, blur, motion blur. And then, yeah, you can get like rain or snow, depending on what you need. So that is for dust standard. Dust grain light is a lot finer grain, which is why I call it dust grain light. And the light means is usually good for depicting like a light beam, right? So let's say we're in like a dark place, but there's like a bright light coming in. So this is kind of where I'll use this brush to sort of like create a very sort of beam of light effect. And then the toothbrush is another good way to, actually I like to use toothbrush to paint in like splatters, right? Because of how centralized it is and how dense it is, right? Compared to dust. So dust is very evenly spread, very good for like atmospheric, environmental stuff. For toothbrush, it's kind of like named after when you're a kid and you have the arts and crafts class. The teacher gives you a toothbrush, asks you to dip a bit of watercolor on it, and you can spray it on the canvas or paper, and then it creates this kind of effect. So this is really nice for splatters of stuff like mud, blood, other kind of stuff you want to create, or even rust, right? You can just splatter this on and it looks really fine right out of the box. So yeah, these are the 3 particle brushes that I use a lot. There's a couple more that are really rarely used. I wouldn't even say that I use them, right? Just sometimes I come across them and try them out for a little bit, but these 3 are really the staple. And I would say that I'm totally fine if I don't have any other particle brush. These are just fine. Yeah, so that's it for the particle brushes. These definitely can serve a variety of purposes. They're very flexible as well. So for next, let's talk about some of the supplements to the main brushes that are not used that often, but can be situationally helpful. So first, let's go Flat Hard P. So this is basically a flat brush. And the thing about this brush is that it's kind of monodirectional, right? Because if you stroke vertically, it gives you this nice thick line, but if you stroke horizontally, it gives you like a really thin line. And if you try and draw a circle, it's gonna give you this, right? So this, I guess, is good for drawing a like ribbon or something like that, or really specific shape. So let's say I'm drawing in windows on a building. This is a lot easier to use than say a round brush, right? Because let's say I want to draw in 5 windows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's it. We're already done. They are serviceable. They're a little bit, it's a little bit rough because I was quick with it. But if we were to use a round brush, yeah, immediately you can see for the same speed and effort, this brush has its place. So, but it's not used too often. That's why it's in the supplementary category. And then next, we can take a look at the flat medium soft. This is pretty much the same brush as the previous one, but instead it's flatter. I mean, it's a bit broader, right? But it's also a softer as well. So this is another brush that I think can be helpful, but not too often used, because it has this shape that kind of constricts it to a certain direction. And of course, you can change the direction, right? You can change the direction all you want. And not to worry, the preset is still safe, because let's say if I go back to flat medium soft, right, it reverts back to its default. So you can just play around with this and turn the brush in any direction. And last but not least is flat soft, which I think is the really soft brush. Yep. It's really soft, so it's good for kind of layering on like, let's say we're drawing like a billboard or some kind of flat surface and we want to show like the like watermarks or dirt marks going down, dirt streaks, right? This is quite good for adding them on, right? They don't have super hard edges to distort the form or to suggest something they don't want, but it's good for layering on some textures as well. So, but they're generic enough that they are kind of supplements and not specialized, but they're not that useful compared again to the main brush, which basically nothing is useful compared to the main brush. And there's a couple more supplements like the hard elliptical, right, which is basically what it says on the box. Pen hex, which is a hexagonal shaped pen brush. This thing is not something that I use really often, but it's basically part of the collection, so I just keep it there. Anyway, if you can find a purpose for this, it's absolutely great. But basically what this does is, as compared to the standard brush, its opacity is not affected by your pen pressure. So it's always going to stay at 100% opacity. And however, the sort of shape changes, or excuse me, the width of the stroke changes based on your pressure. So this is the difference, right? This is less useful because of that, because you're not always going to be painting solids, right? And this is where the standard brush excels. When you need a bit more opacity control, right? But for this, it could be good for drawing patterns. Like let's say I want to draw like a gold sort of trim, right? I can draw a gold trim. I can draw like fancy patterns and stuff, right? I can draw like stuff like this. Right, and so the moment I have this, right, these are all solid and these are all completely solid. So if I lay it onto like, let's say I draw a character's clothing and I lay this pattern on, it's going to stick on perfectly, and then I can like paint over it, right, with say the rough flat brush by locking the layer. Let's say I want to turn this red, right, and turn it bright red, right, I can just lock the opacity and paint it like this to create highlights or whatever I need. So this is the strength of these kind of opaque brushes. They are really nice to basically create solid patterns with, and they have their place as well. And then let's see what's next. Yeah, Pen Round S is the last one of the supplementary brush. It's basically identical to the Pen Hex brush, but instead of having a hexagonal pattern, it's basically a round pattern. Right, it's perfectly round. And it's of the same, it's not of the same width, right? But it's of the same width directionally speaking. So in each direction, no matter how you move, it looks pretty much about the same. It feels a little less dynamic than the hex brush, but this also has its place if you're trying to draw like, you know, like really, really specific straight lines that you want to control with using like a very solid and opaque pen. So again, rarely used, but still helpful and can be used in a variety of scenarios. And next we'll talk about Thin Details. Thin Details is the brush that I think is good for finishing off, right? So let's say I finish drawing a character's hair and then I go in with Good Pencil. I call it Good Pencil because Photoshop has a default pencil brush that I deleted, and that one's a bad pencil. It has this weird effect where the more you draw, the thicker the lines get, which I guess simulates a real pencil, but I have no idea why you would want that. That is super weird in Photoshop. But so the Good Pencil, it basically stays at the same width no matter how much you use it. You don't have to worry about it going crazy. It basically creates this pencil-like stroke that fades out really, really nicely, right? Like compared to the standard, this is much better at drawing the very thin hair strands. Because at low pressure, it can give a really, really, really light impression, but still leaves, how do I put it? It still creates a full stroke. It doesn't blank out, but it can create a really, really light sort of impression, right, on the painting. So let's say I'm drawing and finishing off the character's hair, right? As you can see in this picture, I actually didn't use it because I either forgot or was too lazy. But as you can see here, if we can throw in a couple of these, right? You can throw in a couple of these as extra detail, right? They add very nicely and kind of complement the whole setup, right? Add a bit of highlights, Yeah, so this is kind of the brush that I like to use when I'm cleaning up and finishing off a painting. It's really good. It's also good for drawing eyelashes, right? For example, if I want to add a couple of eyelashes here or add really fine detail, the good pencil brush is really perfect. It's perfect for this purpose, and yeah, there's not too much to talk about it, but it's also good for sketching if you want to create a pretty sketch, right? Because for me, usually my sketches are only there to serve as a base for later painting, but if you want to create a really pretty sketch, this is also a good pencil brush to use. And then we have its brother, the bold pencil brush, which is why I call good pencil B. It's basically a thicker version of the brush. It still has that nice jagged edge and similar characteristics when it comes to sort of leaving a faint impression even at low, leaving a impression even at low pressure. So yeah, that's this is good pencil B or good pencil bold, right? So these are for the thin details. And then for the last two categories of patterns and textures, these are, I would say, more rarely and uncommonly used. So they are very specific, and I won't go and demo every single one of them. You can definitely try it out for yourself and see what it looks like to you, right? It's almost like a Rorschach test. Is that how you pronounce it? A Rorschach test? That you kind of see what it's good for, right? Like you look at a pattern that comes out and say, oh, you know, this looks like this to me. I could use it for this. But for the patterns, it's basically stuff that needs patterns. For example, if I want to create like a series of generic pattern to sort of populate the area of the canvas that needs to be a bit more filled in, right? Like I'm drawing a building, I'm like, okay, so that we can just add in this as details for like a drain cover, right? I've used this before for that. Multi-line hatch is basically hatching. Not too great when I'm painting in a more painterly style, I guess, but it has its place. Again, very situational. Multi-line messy is an interesting brush. It basically creates a super messy line. Has its own users as well, of course. And multi-line straight is pretty simple and straightforward. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines that you can draw. You can rotate these. Or you can have it like this, right? So these are the pattern brushes. The textures, I'll leave them for you to explore yourself. And yeah, these are going to be it for the main brushes. So again, time is limited, so my explanation sort of kind of ends here for these. But of course, feel free to drop me any question in the comments of the video. I'll try my best to reply to the comments. And so moving on to eraser. Eraser is basically same as a brush, but in reverse, right? You reverse, or rather you erase something that you don't want. So there isn't too much to explain here. The soft eraser is the counterpart of the standard softy. So you basically erase something really softly. The standard is the equivalent of the standard brush. Okay, so let's use this black color. You can ignore the rest. All these are extra stuff that I don't use, but so I won't trouble you with them, right? These all don't seem to have a use for myself, so I want to keep the list compact. So do ignore them. And don't worry, these are the three. I promise you, these are the three that I pretty much use all the time. So again, the first one, soft brush, very self-explanatory. You can just erase softly. Yeah, there's nothing too much to say. Standard brush, right? This one is a bit of like a nuke option. It erases really, really hard, because usually when I want to erase hard, I just kind of remove it, right? There's not too much to talk about. And there isn't any like pressure control. It's more like the pen round S, right? Equivalent of the brush, but in eraser form. But the standard brush, because this is the standard that comes with Photoshop, it's really not laggy, and it's good for clearing big areas and big canvases if you need to. But the issue is that it has this stampy look. You can see the like jagged edges that has this really stampy look. I have no idea how to get rid of it. But I have downloaded this brush that is a really good eraser brush. And I don't know how they did it, but they made it like update more frequently. right? So you can really just get a much cleaner erase. You can see that it's still a bit stampy, but it's much better than, right, let's try a single pass, right? You can see it's much better than this one, right? So if we try a single pass at maximum pressure, okay, so this is maximum pen pressure, right? Right, this is the standard, and this is the standard smooth, which is a user created brush, not by me, excuse me. Right, as you can see, this one is a lot cleaner than this one, right? It doesn't create any jagged edges at all, and it's a bit softer as well. So this brush I think is really, really strong because it just gets rid of the hassle of having this really ugly stampy look. Yeah, so these are the eraser brushes. And then to wrap up, I'll talk quickly about the foliage and detail brushes. So these brushes are a collection of my massive stock of miscellaneous stuff that I have to sort through myself, honestly. But these are the brushes that I think have been the most requested, the sort of very basic or simple, straightforward effects brushes, as well as some foliage brushes that I really, really like. So for these, I honestly just recommend you guys to try them out for yourself to get a feel for which brush or what kind of foliage is good for which, right? For example, I really like this brush. It creates a nice sort of edge pattern, and it's also easy to layer onto, right? Right, let's say I can just change the color and drop in a couple more. Right, and I just created a fairly convincing looking, sort of, although rather simple looking bush. Right, if you want to change the lighting angle, simply use the same brush and paint in some of the areas to give them shadow. And yeah, this is a really, really good brush. So great for foliage in general, and the rest, they are all very specific in their purpose, and then I'll trust that you'll find this out, right? Like for example, Flowers 2 is a good brush because you can draw really fine patterns with it. It's good for foliage or fine foliage in the distance, but it's a bit less pretty compared to this, especially in terms of edges, because it has a lot of these small little bits here and there that dangle everywhere, and then you need to clean up later as well. For the rest, yeah, I'm really not gonna demo all of them. And have fun trying them out for yourself. They're all really, really good. For the water brush is, I think, really important when drawing some kind of water. Ignore water 2 and 3. They are not that great for me, honestly. And I wanted to keep this simple, so I want to use water 1, right? Which is, I think, more than sufficient, honestly, for me. And water 1 basically allows you to do this. Yeah, basically draw water from like a kind of a more foreshortened angle. It's not great if you're looking down, let's say from above, because then each of this will be thicker. I'm not even sure if just transforming it will do the job. Right, if you're looking down from above, perhaps you can try using a transform tool and pulling them up, stretching it up a bit. Yeah, that could be an option, or you might have to draw things manually depending on how much the angle deviates from like the kind of stock angle this brush is meant for. And then moving on from this, we have the Storm Clouds and Death Smoke. This is a default name, I didn't change it. It's also a really long name, so it's easy to look for. And yeah, so this is a nice smoke brush. But the downside is that it's really angular, so you gotta be careful what angle you deploy it in, otherwise you'll create like this weird rotating effect. But again, it's really good for drawing storm clouds, as you can see, right? And death smoke, I guess, whatever that means. And then next, let me just move this storm clouds and death smoke a bit off the frame. And next we have the regular smoke brush, which I think is a better generic smoke brush. It's good just for like your regular smoke and stuff. Right, so if we overlay on top of these storm clouds, that's kind of what it looks like, right? Just smoke, not really clouds. And then moving on to the last couple, ground pebbles. I'm gonna take a moment to find this. Again, as I said, I'm definitely overdue for a cleanup. Yeah, there it is. So ground pebbles is good. Again, like kind of like a foreshortened view of adding like uh, basically ground pebbles. You can use these to sub in for textures or like trash on the floor or stuff like that, but try to remove the pebbly look a little bit before you use it as such. Right, so yeah, that's ground pebbles. And then rock small is basically ground pebbles but more generic, right? It's also good for using, I personally tend to use this for floor textures because it kind of goes well horizontally. Yeah. But otherwise, this is it for the bulk of the foliage and detail brushes. So the last two, forest fog and pine forest. So let me take a look. Yeah, so forest fog is really good. It basically helps you draw a forest in the distance for really quick and cheap. Again, this is a downloaded brush. I did not make this. Definitely whoever made this is an absolute genius. Alright, immediately you can create a forest in distance. Super quick, super easy. I don't draw forests that much, but when I do, you know, definitely I'm looking for chances to use this brush. And then last but not least, pine forest. It does what it says on the box, draws you a pine forest. Just as convenient, pretty great. And yeah, that kind of wraps it up for these for the detail and foliage brushes. I will save this image and then upload it with the video so you guys can just have a reference of which brushes do what. And you don't have to refer back to the video. So yeah, this is pretty much it for this brushes video. I think I've been talking for a really long time already. And then yeah, basically a lesson is just pay attention to the main brushes and then have fun with the rest. That's all I'm gonna say. Definitely you can find your own use for each brush. Yeah, that's not too much to say. And again, a big thank you to all the authors of these brushes who make brushes and I share them for free. I just want to again finally disclaim again that I did not make these brushes. I'm just using them and they are really great brushes and I'm sharing them in that context. And so yeah, and hopefully my explanation is something that has been helpful and helps add a bit more understanding as to how different brushes kind of interact. And yeah, thank you so much for supporting me here on Patreon, and I hope to see you next month.